Coming up on this week's show, how to make your own homebrew Mega Drive development kit.
The Amiga finally gets a decent Street Fighter 2 port.
And we go inside Activision and Acclaim with Rod Cousens.
The Retro Hour podcast is brought to you each week with our good mates at Bitmap Books. Now, one of their books you should definitely check out is Commodore 64, A Visual Compendium, celebrating the vast library of games that made the C64 the most popular home computer of the 80s. You can check that out on the rest of their retro gaming books on their website, bitmapbooks.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 311, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to the podcast that comes out every single Friday and takes you back to the classic days of video games. Or as we like to call it, the golden age of gaming. Because, we do get new people coming into this podcast all the time. And Ravi made a good point just before we started recording. He said, why don't we do a little introduction for people that are just finding us for the first time? Because even though we've been going for 6 years now, every time we see our podcast rising up the Apple podcast chart, which, happens most weeks, that means we're getting a big influx of new people coming through. So people are joining this ride all the time, aren't they?
Yeah, and it's kind of crazy because we started this as an audio project, which was just like with the mad aim of interviewing somebody every single week. And that would be anybody from the industry, the creatives, the kind of management behind it, video game designers and stuff. And it's because these stories, really need to document them. And it's been a period of history that, talking to these guests, we've realised so much has happened, and it's happened so quickly that it's hard to kind of step back and get a picture of what's going on. And we really hope that the show kind of helps people get a picture and also, works out the connections between different companies. Like the amount of knowledge that I've got from just doing this is absolutely insane, and amount of stuff that I've learned about systems and games that I've never really touched before, Well,
I think for us as well, the fact that we are all three of us, lifelong video game fans. So for us doing this, for me, it was, when we started this podcast, it was originally to try and find out the truth behind a lot of the rumors or the urban legends that I read in, magazine articles and stuff back in the day, to actually go to the, the horse's mouth, as it were, and actually get the truth from the people that were there making the industry in its early days.
Yeah, I like the amount of times that I've seen that Moby Games is inaccurate and Wikipedia hasn't got the right information on it and stuff. And, you see a lot of videos on YouTube and people repeating the same facts and stuff, but nothing beats actually going to the source and hearing what they say and kind of, their ideas of what was going back on in the day, even if they contradict each other as well. It's just really exciting. And for me, it was like looking at those game titles at the beginning, the credits, and then thinking how many people we've had on the show that were actually listed on those credits.
So, the 6 years we've been doing this, we spoke to some of our absolute gaming heroes, and today is no exception. Now, we're going to take you behind the scenes on some of the most legendary companies, from over the last 40 years of gaming, including, and particularly, we're going to be focusing on Activision, their kind of early days here in the UK, and also Acclaim as well. Going to be covering from around 1991 up to the mid-2000s when Acclaim went bankrupt. And today we're going to be talking to Rod Cousens. And this, I've got to say, from the 6 years we've been doing this podcast, this is already one of my favourite interviews we've ever done this week.
We have these like distributors that in the UK that would, kind of repackage the games, send them out and stuff. And other companies didn't have that much of a presence. And Rod's talking all about the kind of early days of getting different games, working with some of the top leading games, and this whole period that we cover in this interview is absolutely mental. It's like we managed to compress it down, and God, there's some awesome things that you got as well, Dan. Finally got someone talking about Rise of the Robots.
Which Rise of the Robots, because Rod, I don't think he talks about it that often. As you said, Joe,
I think anyone does.
He spoke about Rise of the Robots. We do struggle to get people on to talk about that.
Yeah, you did say, just before we started recording, I'm not on this interview, and you did say we got some juicy stuff on Rise of the Robots. And I was like, oh, wow, nobody ever wants to talk about that. And, you pointed out, he did say, you know what, you've got to take the good with the bad. So let's talk about, it wasn't all perfect. It wasn't all smooth sailing. So that was really cool. Did you manage to ask him, though, about the Turok Rage Wars competition? You did?
Yes, I did. Which was
perfect. Don't spoil it.
there was some interesting gimmicky stuff that they did later on.
Love it.
Let's say in Activision, yeah.
Yeah, so we go from, the early days of the industry when he was working at Quicksilver, on
Jeff
the home
Minter
computers, guys like him. So there's a load of stuff in this interview. You're going to really enjoy the story behind there, what kind of went wrong with R-Type and porting that to the home systems as well, and the drama behind all that. I mean, there's some fascinating tales, stuff we haven't heard before, so it is an honor to be joined by Rod Cousens. He'll be coming up on the podcast in around 25 minutes from now. Now, as well as bringing you legends, veterans of the industry on the show each week to get the inside story, we also update you on what's been happening in the world of retro gaming and technology each week as well. First half of the show is the news that's been going on. Actually, January is normally a pretty quiet time for retro gaming news, but actually, it seems like there's quite a lot going on this month, including Nintendo, who are now offering retro gaming posters as part of the My Nintendo rewards. So tell us a bit about this, Joe. What's this about?
So I've done my research, luckily. Bear with me here. I think I know how this works. So
there's always a first.
There's always a first.
They're not NFT posters, are they?
No, they're real posters, which is fantastic. So Nintendo of Europe are offering out rewards for their Platinum Points system. And we'll talk about the rewards first. So they've launched this week 3 retro N64 posters. They've got a Zelda Ocarina of Time poster, a Mario Kart 64 one, and a Star Fox 64 one, or Lilac Wars. It is listed as Star Fox 64, but it's Lilac Wars, and for us UK people. But they look pretty cool. They're like the Ocarina of Time ones, kind of looks like custom artwork, and they really, really look like of the era. What you'd have in your room. When you were a teenager or, a young kid back in the day with your favourite games plastered across the walls. The Mario Kart 64 ones, like the box art, and the Star Fox 64 one's really, really cool. And I think it goes really well with the fact that they've recently launched, the N64, on the Switch. So I think Nintendo are realising, that these games are really popular at the moment. There's a lot of N64 games actually being re-released on the Switch and stuff like that at the moment. So...
And they work well, actually. I've been playing some of them.
They work really well. And, it's not often I find, in the 6 years of us doing this, that Nintendo go back and look at these things. They usually just kind of push forward and they don't look in the rearview mirror. They just they don't tend to put these games back out or stuff like that. Not that they don't accept, that these things have happened and celebrate them and stuff like that, but you don't see it that often. So it's really cool to see them doing it as one of their rewards. So I had to check out what are these rewards. Is it an NFT kind of thing? Is it something you pay for?
Did they come with posters originally? Because
some games, so some games would come with posters and maps and stuff like that, or a map. like GTA would come with a poster, but it's
because I remember even GTA on the PlayStation came with a poster built in. Yeah, on the flip side, but also. PC games and stuff, some of them would come with posters in the big box releases, but console stuff did that?
Yeah, some console games did it. So, a lot of Nintendo games did it as well. I can't think any right now off the top of my head, but I know, A Link to the Past, which was the Super Nintendo Zelda, did it. Don't think these games had posters that came with the games, but there definitely would have been posters of these games, I imagine, in Nintendo Power and stuff like that. So it's cool to see them revisit them. But in terms of the points, you ask, I wasn't too sure how you earned these platinum points. So they cost 500 platinum points for the set. So you get all 3 of them in the set, I believe, which is pretty cool. So I thought they might be points that you earn from buying Switch games. You buy this Switch game and you get 100 points to claim on the online store. But from what I understand, they're actually from completing weekly tasks, to do with playing games on your Switch and stuff like that. So this week, for example, you can get 300 platinum points from playing Animal Crossing by just linking your Animal Crossing Pocket Camp to your Nintendo account, or you can get 30 points from just activating your account, and you can also get it from like app games. So like playing Toad Rally on Super Mario Run daily gets you 10 points for playing that so many days in a row and stuff like that. So, 100 points for just linking your Nintendo network ID to your Nintendo account. You get 100 points for that. So it's just from being a Nintendo fan and playing Nintendo games. So obviously you've got to purchase the games and stuff in the first place and purchase apps on your phone and stuff like that. But from just playing them and linking up your accounts and clearing World 2 on Super Mario World and Super Mario Run 2 will get you 50 points. So
I always got the impression that the rewards were more to try to get people to play their mobile games, stuff like Animal Crossing, Pocket Camp. You can get for free on the App Store. And I have seen some people saying here as well that if you just download Animal Crossing on the iPhone, which is free, connect Twitter and Facebook, you get given 600 points and you just delete it off your phone. So
there you go. There you go.
It's quite easy to get
them.
So
it is to get people to play the mobile game apps and stuff like that. But it's Nintendo at the end of the day. That's, it's a massive company. They're going to get you to do that. So, and then you get gold reward points for actually doing in-game purchases and stuff like that. So it's good that they've got like the platinum and the gold separate, and the platinum ones are the free ones, and you do get rewards. You do have to pay for postage on your rewards, which kind of makes sense, but it's good to see in the world that we live in at the moment that it's actual physical posters, and like Ravi says, it's not just NFTs that get sent to
it's
you.
kind of like incentivized gaming. So I saw Red Dead Redemption had one, which was like, the multiplayer, which was it go online every day and you'll get this amount of gold or whatever. And I think it's probably because they've got stats which have come back and said the amount of Switch owners that aren't connected to this. So smartly they've said, well, we'll just do a poster thing, and it's not going to cost as much, but it incentivizes and it gets people to go in and actually do that physical thing, link up their Facebook account or whatever. So it's a kind of nice way of doing it, and you get a little bit back from something that you would previously not really get anything for. So I think it's all right.
I'm looking at this and thinking, it would be so cool if they just sold them.
Yeah.
You just buy them for Nintendo.
You just buy it. Yeah.
Dan's just thinking, I can't be asked to play these games. I just want to buy them and put them up in my wall.
They do look really cool, though, don't they?
They do look cool. I really like the Ocarina of Time one. That's really, really cool.
Yeah, and they'll probably be on eBay for like, £100 or something next week anyway.
There you go.
I ain't paying that much though, so no one get any ideas. So we'll link up that story if you want to find out how many rewards you need and how to get hold of them. You'll find it all in our show notes. We put all the stories in there. You don't have to Google around. You'll find them at theretrohour.com, or just check the text on your podcast app. They're all in there too. Now, Street Fighter 2, obviously one of the most legendary fighting games of all time. Mainly for me, I remember, I know it came out on the Mega Drive and stuff like that. To me, it was always an arcade game first, and really felt more at home on the Super Nintendo. I always classed it as a SNES game at home.
Yeah.
Although, we did get a port onto the computer that I had at the time, and I know you did as well, Ravi, the Commodore Amiga. How would you sum up the Amiga version of Street Fighter 2?
I thought it wasn't that
Ravi?
bad, It was the problem is that it was like one button for everything. So you had tons of like combos and stuff, forever loading as well. Like switching discs between the characters was really frustrating. I think there was worse ports of stuff that came later on, and Amiga never really shined for like the the fighting games. So there were some good ones though, but I don't think it did what it could have, and this kind of really shows it. It's a port we'd actually talked about before, which was just a proof of concept which had been made on Pixel Shade channel on YouTube, where they'd actually shown, right, I'm just going to recreate this scene on Street Fighter and kind of, see what I can do, see how much I can get it close to the arcade. I remember there was a whole thing about, there was a Street Fighter 2 Turbo came out on the Amiga as well, and there was a whole thing years ago about cleaning it up and cleaning up the backgrounds and just making it run better. And there was a whole like little modding scene on that, because obviously it hadn't been ported over with like the love and care that someone can give it now, but that's also due to this awesome engine that's come out for the Amiga. So all the games that are being released at the moment are being released by a company called Pixel Glass, and these are like, Worthy was one that recently came out. Metro Siege was another one that they've done. Dread as well, which is a a really, really awesome kind of Doom clone as well. Metro Siege is that kind of Streets of Rage one. And this is all based on the Scorpion engine. And the idea of the Scorpion engine is it takes modern components and ideas and kind of ways of doing it, like, converting the PNG files and stuff. And it targets the Amiga 500. So it's targeting like the lowest kind of powered Amiga that you can get. And I think that's really cool. A lot of these ports came out with like, you need an extra RAM expansion or accelerator card. So using this Scorpion engine, they've actually now made a playable demo of that, well, a tech demo of that Street Fighter kind of that we saw on YouTube.
Yeah, and actually, this looks really impressive, especially compared to the release version that we got on the Amiga, which I know you mentioned then about the buttons and everything. The biggest complaint for me about the Amiga version was how bad the scrolling was. It was so jerky.
I was about to say the scrolling on that version is just terrible, isn't it?
Ruins the original port to the Amiga, which, back then it always baffled me why they put out such a substandard version.
Well, also,
it was such a big license.
Well, I don't think they had this engine as well. So this engine was like with the Pixel Glass people, but it's also being used by this. This port is actually done by Nesso Games, who did Super Delivery Boy for the Amiga as well. So there's lots of different people now using this engine, and I think they didn't have the technology developed behind it. It was just they didn't know all the tricks that they do nowadays.
But I remember, stuff like was it Elfmania? That was a great beat 'em up game on
that was done by demo coders, though. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah. That's from saying the hardware could do it blatantly. 'Cause back then, I remember reading like, the Amiga's not powerful enough to run Street Fighter 2 properly like the Super Nintendo. And even looking at this, graphically, it looks like it might just be my imagination. I'm sure maybe you can look at it a bit more with fresher eyes, Joe. It looks a bit lower color than the Super Nintendo version.
Yeah, the Amiga version looks a little washed out, the original version, compared to like the Super Nintendo version and even the Mega Drive version. And my memories of the Amiga version is going a bit off track here, but it's on an episode of Father Ted, the old Channel 4 show.
Yeah.
Where Father Dougal's playing it with like the bad boy priest, and they're like playing the Amiga version with the one button with the stick. And I always remember thinking, like, why does that version look so choppy and washed out compared to, and I'm more familiar with the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive version than the arcade version. But yeah, the version that, Ravi's been talking about here, the tech demo version of it, it just kind of fixes everything that was wrong with the Amiga version, the original Amiga version for me. Like straight away, the color palette just looks so much better. It is not particularly super bright or anything like that, but it just looks more real, and just the tones in it are just so much nicer. And it just doesn't look washed out anymore. Like I know. I keep saying
this is targeted for the ECS computer. So the ECS Amiga, which has a lower color palette. I think it's 16 or 64 for the ECS, and then the Amiga AGA machines are like 256 colors. So if they did an AGA port, they could probably have it kind of in the nicer color. But I kind of like them targeting it for the 500 because it was the most popular one, and it was the one that everybody had,
And I like the color palette in this. Yeah, like you said, Joe, it doesn't look too cartoony.
Yeah,
gives it more of a gritty kind of look, which I quite like. And you can play this by the looks of it, this downloadable ADF. I haven't tried this yet, but I intend to this weekend. Looks like you can only play as Ryu and Ken in this. It's not a finished game, and apparently he's saying, it's only meant to be a technical demo. He said, copyright goes to the respective owners and everything as well. He's not going to make it into a full game, but he said there's a little disclaimer in here. Maybe it can be an inspiration for someone to work on a full remake of the game.
There you go. Hopefully it happens then.
Well, I think we've been seeing so many good titles coming out, and like the foundations for stuff is there now. So, I just can't wait to see more stuff arrive and ports get kind of cleaned up. And yeah, it's just really exciting to see the kind of releases that are happening in the Amiga. And especially working at the Amiga magazine, I'm seeing loads of stuff at the moment on Amiga Addict. It's like, wow.
Well, that's the thing, because I don't know what Capcom are like with how harsh they go after fan projects. But it would be cool, because, obviously Capcom are never going to remake it for the Amiga, so it would be nice if they let the fans do it.
In my experience, and we spoke about it before, Capcom are pretty good. Like when Daymare came out, which was a Resident Evil clone. That was a fan project of Resident Evil 2, people remaking it, and then Capcom contacted them and actually invited them down to the studio and said, look, we're actually making Resident Evil 2 remake, so you're doing really well with yours, but can you make it into something different? And they actually showed them some stuff. So Capcom are usually pretty respectful, I guess is the best word for it. So I guess unless they're intending on putting out another Amiga version of Street Fighter, they'll probably just leave them to it, to be honest.
So that's reassuring words for someone who might want to make this into a full game.
I mean, don't take that as gospel. I don't work for Capcom.
You can blame Joe if he gets sued.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you want to download that, it's an ADF file. You can back it on a floppy disk or your Go Take or whatever. I'll link that up in our show notes as well. Obviously, a lot of people are making new games for retro systems. Did you ever stop to think kind of what it was like, if you were making a game back in the retro days, for example, making a Mega Drive game back in the late 80s or early 90s, the kind of kit you'd need, because obviously back then for consoles, really it was these official development kits that you needed to get hold of. And we've talked to people on this podcast before about how expensive they often were to get the official ones. I mean, sometimes you were talking hundreds of thousands of dollars to get the official development kits, back then. And actually, I'm looking through, there is a great article on retroreversing.com that details the amount of different Mega Drive / Genesis development kits that were around back in the console's heyday. And there are loads of them in here as well. I mean, start with something called the Super Mega Drive, which was a very early development kit as well. And this looks like, it's really just a massive circuit board. It looks like a huge old school PC pretty much, but with Mega Drive ports on there. And I know that some developers use stuff like, the Mega PC or the Terra Drive back then that were actual, PCs and Mega Drives to make them. But the way looking at it, there were loads of different Mega Drive development systems that they made back then. But actually, this article here by a guy called Torre Nestinus, he's a guy who actually made his own Mega Drive hardware dev kit from scratch back in the early 90s. Because he couldn't afford one of the official ones, and he wanted to make Mega Drive games at home. Now, I'll link up this article. It is pretty technical. I've got to say that, but it's very cool.
I thought, when you linked us up to this, I thought he'd made it recently. I didn't realise he'd made it, back in the heyday of the Mega Drive.
This was 30 years ago he made
which is
this.
Insane. This has got, hundreds, if not thousands of cables and stuff like that. So he just did this. He just did this from his own know-how. There was no Google or anything like that for him to jump on.
No.
It's important because I remember going and seeing the guy who did Tanglewood, Big Evil Corp, and he had a Mega CD development kit as well that he was actually using, and it's pretty amazing. And he was like, to get this dev kit's really hard, and he kind of kept it close to him and had it for years. So it's interesting to see that maybe he can rework these designs or make it available for more people.
What I love about it is, he was actually doing development on the Atari 1040 STE. So an Atari ST he was using, which obviously has the same CPU as a Mega Drive. Got the Motorola 68K in there. So it kind of goes really in depth. This article is several pages long and it goes really in depth technically. But this guy says, really, he knew 68K assembly language, and he thought there must be a way that he can actually do the coding on the Atari ST and get it over to the Mega Drive. But obviously he had to kind of figure out stuff like how the Mega Drive handles cartridges, the interface between the cartridge and the RAM of the system as well. So really he did quite a bit of reverse engineering, not only of the Mega Drive, but also the cartridges and all the buffer chips in there as well. And he had to build his own PCBs. And eventually what he got is this system. There's a few different prototypes, and there's images of them all and in-depth explanations on how they all worked. But what he did is he actually made a PCB cartridge you could put into the Mega Drive that had a serial port on there, and he would do all the coding on his Atari ST and kind of squirt that over. Over onto an EEPROM that then he could run on the Mega Drive. And actually, he says he didn't actually make any Mega Drive games after he spent so long getting all this together. I think he exhausted himself by making this.
I was about to ask, did he actually make any games that came out or anything? But pretty exhausted after that.
He used a program called Turbo Assembler. Assembler on the ST.
Yeah, and there's also, he talks about how he makes some music for it as well, a program called Audio Sculpture, which is a sound tracker. So, it's really interesting if you want to see, because like you said, Joe, in that pre-internet era, even someone who makes kind of Mega Drive games using emulation today and getting it on the original hardware, I think is pretty cool. But the fact that someone was doing this, homebrew style 30 years ago in his bedroom, that is pretty hardcore.
Not to upset the guy if he's listening or anything, but the fact that he never actually made any games on it, maybe it doesn't work. He's just got a load of circuitry and just made it look like it works. I'm joking, of course, but
you cynic, Joe.
I'm joking.
Now, before we get into our chat with Rod Cousens, let's take a quick break and give a big thank you to one of our sponsors, because, at the moment, we're getting ready, and I can't believe we're saying this, first time in, over 2 years, we're getting ready for some live events again. We are dipping our toe into the water of going to events again, aren't we?
Yeah, we're going to be going to the Doncaster Gaming Market at the end of February. And Ravi's even staying overnight for that one, because you're going to be hosting a table, aren't you? And I'm going to be dipping my toe in potentially some other ones up north later in the year. And Ravi's even hosting one.
I'm hosting one, and I'm also going to VCF East in New Jersey in America. So
exactly.
Yeah, we're all kind of excited and getting ready to come out of the house and emerge.
I think, we're talking the other day that we've all booked flights and we've got stuff planned. We're going abroad again this summer, we're going to be jumping on planes.
It's crazy.
And going places, so it is amazing. So, the world is opening up again, which is incredible. And our friends at Harry's, now obviously they've been big supporters of the Retro Hour podcast. And, you might have heard us talking about their incredible razors before and what a great shave they give you. But actually, Harry's, they're here to revamp your whole routine. They do a lot more than just razors, including obviously the close shaves. They do, give you flake-free hair, all the way to clear, healthy skin. Harry's is here to help guys feel good. Now, we want you to get a free travel-sized shower gel with a trial set and give them a try to improve your morning routine. Now, particularly if you've got, holidays coming up and maybe you're going to be traveling again. With this, you'll get their expertly engineered weighted handle, a 5-blade cartridge crafted by artisans in their own German factory, complete with a precision trimmer, a handy foaming shave gel for effective lubrication. You get the travel blade cover with, everything you need for life's adventures in there as well. A free shower gel, which we're including for Retro listeners as well. And I know us guys have been fans of Harry's anyway. You always said, Joe, I think you used to use an electric razor, but then switching to Harry's, it gives you a really close shave, something that I know kind of changed your life when you used it.
Yeah, so, I tend to keep a beard because I am terrified of shaving because I get such bad acne and cysts from shaving. And whenever I've used Harry's, it's actually been really smooth. And I don't know if that's just down to the razor or if that's down to the gel that comes with it. But either way, the combination of it just works really well with my skin, which is a particularly sensitive skin. So I've always found and trusted that Harry's actually does give me a really, really good shave without any of the mess that comes with it.
Not that I've kissed you on the cheek, Joe, after you've shaved with Harry's, but it looks baby smooth.
It does look baby smooth. It knocks 10 years off me, put it that way.
And obviously stuff like cleansing and exfoliating before you shave, that increases the chances of cleaner results as well. And their products are formulated with zero sulfates, no parabens, dyes, they're alcohol-free as well, no nasties in them as well. So we will need to take up this incredible offer and give Harry's a try. Let them transform your morning routine. There's nothing like, you could have a shower and a shave at the same time, get out of the house quicker. Perfect if you go on holiday, get this in your travel case. So if you want to support the Retro Hour, get your own shower shave kit right now by redeeming a free Harry's trial set. All you need to cover is the £3.95 for delivery. They will sort everything else. So head to this website right now, harrys.com/retro. Have your set delivered and start a shave plan. Your freebie is going to be added at checkout, so no codes or anything to remember. Just make sure that you use our exclusive link so they know that we sent you. That's harrys.com/retro, and a big thank you to our good mates at Harry's for their support of the Retro Hour podcast. Now, of course, Patreon is the lifeblood of this show. We have sponsors some weeks, but Patreon is really what keeps this podcast coming out every single Friday. And I think it's fair to say, we mentioned it before, that we couldn't do this show if it wasn't for our loyal patrons, could we?
Not at all. And the community's so nice as well. I really enjoy chatting to our patrons. We just did a patrons chat, which was absolutely awesome. The hangout, and we do the After Hours podcast as well, which we just recorded this week. And we've hit episode 20 of the After Hours podcast. So if you support us on Patreon, you will get 20 episodes extra.
Yeah, and we covered the year 1993. And I think before we went into that, because I mean, the After Hours podcast, we kind of do lots of different stuff, but every other episode is like looking at 1 year in gaming and tech. And 93, my God. We started looking at that, me and you, Joe. We were looking, through online and talking about, stuff that we remember from that year. But there was just so much happened in 1993. We could have done like a 5-hour podcast about
it. It was so much. I mean, it felt like we ran over massively on there. But like the episode went out today, and you said it came back sounding absolutely fantastic. But like you say, we just could have talked for hours and hours and hours about 1993, and some really really obscure failed systems came out that year. So none of the big three came out that year, but there was just so much to talk about, and I did absolutely love our patrons hangout, as Ravi pointed out, which we did this Sunday just gone. And we do talk retro, and we share what retro things we've bought recently and stuff like that, but we always go off on a tangent talking about horror films, VHS, anything like that. But this week we were talking about nuclear bombs and nuclear fallout and what we would all do and stuff like that. And it just feels like, there's like 30 of you sat around a table at the pub all just having a chat, and it just works. Nobody talks over each other or anything like that. It just works really, really well. And, it's been something amazing to look forward to every month.
Yeah, so you can join us for that. All patrons are welcome. Obviously, gold members and above get the After Hours podcast each month as well. I must admit, this month has been probably the quietest month we've ever had on Patreon in terms of new sign-ups. I think our last one was Mike on January the 9th. So, it's been a quiet few weeks. We get that, a lot of people are still a bit skint after Christmas and everything. But if you would like to support us, it does make a big difference. And obviously, just make sure that we can cover all the running costs of doing the show. We're not paying for doing it out of our own pocket. And you get all those perks as well. You also get the normal podcast early. You get it ad-free as well. And also, you get exclusive stories. And actually going to be dropping a full exclusive interview show for our patrons in a couple of weeks' time as well. So we'd love you to join us on there. Come see us on the Hangouts too. All the details to sign up to our Patreon. You can do it for the cost of a cup of coffee once a month. That's all it takes to keep this podcast going, and you'll find all the details at theretrohour.com. Right then, let's get into some amazing stories going inside classic companies like Activision and Acclaim and lots more as well. With this week's special guest, Rod Cousens, is next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it is time for the main event, then the bit of the show that we all look forward to, where we welcome on a veteran of the video games industry to get some stories about, what happened in the industry back in the heyday, those early days when it was just kind of finding its feet. And our guest today has worked for some of the biggest companies in gaming history, including Acclaim, Activision, Codemasters, Quicksilver back in the 80s as well. Let's welcome on the legendary Rod Cousens. How you doing, Rod?
I'm very well, thank you, and thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we really appreciate you taking some time to share your memories with us, and we always like to kind of go back to the beginning with our guests and find out, what initially got them into video games in general. I mean, do you remember your first gaming experience then, where you first discovered it?
I do. I was loitering in pubs at that time, and there was a coin-op machine, and it had this game on it called Breakout. And it used to very successfully extract money from me as I pursued levels to get to the ultimate goal. That got me hooked on gaming, and I went from there into home computers with the advent of Sinclair ZX81, and that was my first role at Quicksilver, really.
So, did you have any machines yourself at home?
Yeah, I had some very primitive machines, including the old Atari 2600, and I actually also had an Imagic console back in the day, a very rare thing. But the one that really took it, and it's true how it describes it, into the home was the ZX81, and mainly as a consequence of the people I knew and worked with and the things we were able to do, because it was a combination of skills that really started to open up us being in the gaming market and going off doing things.
Did you have any experience typing in those codes and kind of doing your own programming?
Yeah, I did, and got unbelievably frustrated. I used to take all the prints out of the magazines in those days and laboriously enter them, and then find they didn't work properly, and would have to start again or try and figure it out. So, but we did occupy a lot of time doing things like that. Yeah.
And even trying to get stuff typed in on that ZX81 keyboard was a challenge and a half.
Yeah, it was. You're absolutely right, but I didn't have the biggest thumbs and fingers, so I probably had some advantage over others. But it absolutely was. And then when it didn't register, and you had to try and figure it out because you'd gone on and had to go back, all these wondrous things. But we were committed. We were real pioneers in those days.
Yeah, it must have just felt magical, that kind of first time you managed to get a program running and something happening on your television.
Yeah, the whole aspect of it was magical because you realized that something was happening. And it was so exciting to be part of it. When people talk today about, disruptors, whether that's technology companies or whatever, the true disruptors were back in those days because the industry didn't actually exist as such. And we all used to assemble at the horticultural halls in Westminster where, we had booths which were little more than trestles with planks across them covered in black felt. And, we all used, and it was very, very friendly. It was whether it was Quicksilver, Bug Bite, Salamander, Silversoft, all these companies that were around, and Britain was leading the way. And there was a real feeling about it. And the breaks would be stale sandwiches upstairs with a beer and loading up cars with tapes. And it was great. It was a magical time.
It really was that kind of cottage industry stuff. And how did you end up then kind of entering the industry and joining Quicksilver?
Well, a friend of mine who was an electrical engineer who I'd been at school with, he introduced me to a guy called Nick Lambert, who was one of the original founders, and I met him. And when people talk about the meeting, it was I was looking for a company. I was driving along. I found this terraced house in a part of Southampton, no name. I knocked the door. This guy with long blonde hair down to his knees, an Aran sweater with holes everywhere and jeans came to the door. And I told him I was looking for Nick Lambert. And he said, "You found him, man." And he said, "Come in." And he made me a cup of coffee off this grimy old cup off of a side, and it was so hot. Otherwise, I'm not sure I'd have stayed. And around it, the phone never stopped ringing. It was a sketch where I'd start talking, then I'd be interrupted, start talking, then I'd be interrupted. But that was really the start. I got on very well with him, and we started working together on bits and pieces. What he did was, his initial thing was to build RAM packs for the ZX81. And about 3:30, 20 to 4 at night, all these kids would come in from the local school and put them in jiffy bags because we'd sold them mail order and we had all the money up front. And then he had a friend called John Hollis, and John Hollis, who's a software engineer, wrote a basic game that we could embed in the RAM packs. And so it went from that, and around it, another friend was Mark Isles, and he did the marketing for the company. And, great strides were made when we did our first full color inlay in the pack. We were terribly excited about all of that. So that was how it came together. It was a group of guys in Southampton working out of friends' properties in the end and putting this company together. And when we'd written a new game, drive up to London to tape duplicating company and have them manufactured on cassette and drive back. That was it.
I know the Quicksilver released, it was mainly Commodore 64 and Spectrum games, but I know there were conversions and original games for the VIC-20, the Dragon, the Auric Atmos, and the BBC Micro and the Electron. Was it hard, covering such a big range of machines and handling all these conversions? Because they all have different capabilities, didn't they?
Yeah, it was hard, but the reason we did it was in those days we would place an ad looking for games. And we were offering 25% royalties, which was a big deal. And all these kids, you were talking about, bedrooms and single guys being able to program. So all these kids came forward with different skills on different machines. And so rather than constrain it, we started to cross-fertilize ideas, introduce them to each other, and seeing whether they could use code, not use code, seeing what their programming strengths were. And it wasn't as hard as it from a technical point of view as it was from a introductory point of view in making them gel. I mean, it was like being a welfare place, because I had their mothers calling me,
Right.
and so forth, making sure they weren't up to no good, or making sure that we were taking care of them and feeding them properly. And half of these guys were moonlighting at university, but that was what made it. That's what made it great.
Well, obviously, Grid Runner by Jeff Minter,
Yeah.
who's gone on to become another legend in the industry,
Yeah.
was a big hit. I mean, what was kind of the story behind that game then and the acquisition?
Yeah, well, we were local, right? He was in Basingstoke, and I was in Southampton. He had Commodore 64 skills, or Commodore skills. He was always out there. He'd been ill, he'd been hospitalized, and while in hospital, this really piqued his interest. Around it, interestingly enough, as the company Quicksilver grew, our accountant knew his mother and Hazel Minter and connected us. And so I got together with Jeff Minter. I drove up to Basingstoke, or Aldermaston, just outside Basingstoke, and just hung out with him. And I thought he was a very out there, talented guy with some real vision. And we were stronger on Sinclair than we were on Commodore. And so it was a complementary thing. He wasn't that interested in the publishing side of life, really. So we took more of the weight of that away from him and let him concentrate on designing games. And we were prepared to give him a big canvas, and exploit his ideas. And it was a great relationship. I mean, I still think a lot of him to this day, and think he was one of the true visionaries in our industry. Often criticized, not necessarily as commercial as he could have been, true to his principles. I mean, he was always his ideas and everything were always slightly wacky, and his love of llamas, which was real. That was always a talking point, but he never sold himself out. He was never like that. He would follow through on his vision and his dreams, and he's true to his principles.
Well, Ant Attack was another revolutionary game at the time. Was that like a Spanish company that you guys did a deal with, and then?
No, that was Bugaboo in Spain. Ant Attack was Sandy Sandy White up in Scotland, and that was another hysterical thing, because when I talked about we advertise for games and so forth, that came in the post in a jiffy bag. Just literally that. We were in Southampton, and we had a product manager called Paul Cooper, and it arrived in a jiffy bag. I was sat one floor up, and he came running up, could barely contain his breath. He said, "You got to see this. You got to see this," and went downstairs and loaded it up, and that was Ant Attack. Now, he'd also submitted it at the time to Scion, and they hadn't responded to him. And he lacked confidence, so he thought no one was interested in it, and we couldn't believe it. And he had a girlfriend who was great at art. They were both up there in Edinburgh Art School, I think it was, and Angela Sutherland. And I called them, and I said, "We liked the game, and could I come up and see them?" And you could feel the suspicion down the phone. He said, "Why? Why do you want to do that?" And I said, "Well, we really like the game." And he said, "Well, you don't need to come all the way up here." And I said, "Well, okay, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll fly you down, and I'll pick you up from the airport and drive you down to Southampton, and we can hang out together, and you can see if you like us and take it on from there." And he said, "Why do you want to spend that money?" And they were very suspicious. Anyhow, I did persuade him to fly down. And in those days, when you walked into Heathrow, the baggage carousel, you could walk straight into the baggage carousel. He said, how will I know you?" And I mean, it was as simple as this and as corny as this. I said, I'll stand by the baggage carousel holding a copy of the Daily Mirror. And I didn't know how many other people would be there in that same position. But he found us, and I drove them both down to Southampton. We got on really well. They like John Hollis a lot. They like Nick a lot. And it blended as people. And I told them we wanted to sign it. And I knew if they went back, we stood a chance of losing the game. So I said, we'll put you up in a hotel in Southampton and you can think about it. And he said, why do you want to do that? Why do you want to spend this money? I said, look, you're down here now. And if we're going to work together, just think about it. I said, you don't have to hang out with us. Just think about it. Anyhow, that's what happened. And they signed, and the rest is history. And when it went out there with those Escher-like graphics, I mean, people were astounded by it, and people were, there was a DJ on Radio 1 at the time, and they were doing a very early feature on games, and Tony Blackburn was going, how can you do graphics like this? How can you have graphics like this? It's amazing. And the only other thing that came close thereafter was, Ultimate Play the Game, which became Rare, and the Stamper Brothers, and stuff like that. So halcyon days, and we did great stuff. And as I said, groundbreaking stuff. These were not, this was all really original and different, a different steer.
Well, it was the first isometric game. Basically, it was a 3D soft solid. Was the kind of technology that he developed and patented as well, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly right. To tell you how far-reaching this was, a man who has been very influential in the field of video games in the UK and indeed on the global stage is a guy called Chris Deering, who ran PlayStation. And when he started off life in games, he was at a company called Spinnaker. And I went out to see to CES in Chicago and met him. And he looked at me and he said, Quicksilver, Ant Attack, how do we get the distribution rights for that game? And that conversation, so he recognized early, but that conversation forged a lifelong relationship in all guises. And also, you have to remember that this was a linear game, and he was dealing on a format which was early floppy disks. So, for him, he knew all about it. And as I say, we had a common interest from there on in.
Well, Quicksilver also published their first licensed game, The Snowman, obviously, which is now, an adapted part of Christmas now, from watching the cartoon series. And it was a book by Raymond Briggs. I mean, what was kind of the backstory there and that game?
Yeah. We did do all that stuff. And as I say, we tried to venture into areas that others didn't get. And bearing in mind, this was a period where there was no readily available data. Most of it was intuitive or, friends and so forth. Today, I mean, data scientists and analysts play a big role in the decision-making process. And but back then, it was very much intuitive. And Quicksilver, as I say, was pooling of friends' skills, and one of which was an artist who we used to do a lot of our covers, a guy called Dave Rowe. And his wife had also done books, done the art in books, etc. Very fairy tale, picturesque, that type of thing, very fine, detailed art. And she was taught in Brighton by Raymond Briggs. And Dave Rowe, when Snowman came out and was a massive success on TV, Dave Rowe said, why don't we go and speak to Raymond Briggs and see if he'd be interested in, putting it on a home computer. And that's what we did. He was fantastic. He was more interested in getting it done than any commercial deal. And he gave us the rights, and we did it. And we launched it in a theatre in Leicester Square, and he came along to that. And my introduction to it was spread-eagled on the stage with a mic in my hand, because we had this backdrop, very corny, of snow and snowmen and things like that. And that was how we did the thing. And he worked together with us, and it was great.
Well, I know there was some talk at the time about, Quicksilver may be doing a video game version of Briggs' other well-known work, When the Wind Blows, which was that something you decided was just a bit too sensitive to release on it as a game?
It was really the commercial side of it more than anything else. I mean, there were a number of things that we were trying to do. We were pretty adventurous. For example, we did the game with the Thompson twins. Yeah. And that was also adventurous. But these things, when you're involving third parties like that, only come about when all the commercial terms can make sense. And it's one thing having the original author, you've then got the publisher, and, you go down things like that. Plus timing was an issue. And so, events conspired against us, really. But yeah, we looked at a lot of things like that. I mean, we actually even did, funnily enough, a darts game with Eric Bristow. So, and he was easy to do. And we did a Rupert game, and I then discovered that 50% of the rights of Rupert were owned by Express newspapers and 50% was owned by Paul McCartney, because as he was growing up, he was a huge Rupert Bear fan. And he then had the Frog song going out in the charts. So I had to go up to MPL to meet them. And we put the game together, and he was pretty enthralled by it. And this is, very early 80s.
Well, you mentioned the Thompson Twins adventure as well, which was, Thompson Twins, a group. They had Dr. Doctor in the charts at the time. And that was actually released as a flexi disc mounted on the cover of CMVG magazine. Yeah. What was kind of the story there, and why did you decide on that kind of method of distribution then? That was quite unique at the time.
Well, cover mounts were becoming more prevalent. And, the side effect of that was an adverse reaction to retail. And in those days, people like W.H. Smith and Boots were a big deal. And they were trying to block cover mounts because they felt, or they were suggesting or discouraging us from doing it because they felt it impacted on the game sales and so forth. Original cover mounts had they were like a trailer. Right. But in trying to outdo one another, more games companies were putting more and more and more content on it. So the idea became, this was put forward by Tim Metcalf, who was the editor of Computer and Video Games at the time. And he said, because I'd talked about music and games and so forth, he said, why don't we try something different? And if we can go and get an artist, if they'll do it and they'll agree to it, that would be one thing. But then we have to get a games company that could develop it and publish it, so as to speak, and then use because magazine distribution was only one specific part. A lot of the magazines weren't international. So there were all these things to consider. And he came up with the idea of the Thompson twins. I went down to meet the three of them and their manager at the bottom of the New Kings Road, and they were really up for it. Unbelievably creative, great to work with. We're not prima donnas, didn't dictate things to us, but wanted to work with us. And then we found a guy that would program it who could work with them, and we were late. And that was the interesting thing. So it wasn't without its hiccups, but it was very adventurous, and we pulled it all off. And in many ways, it's thanks to Tim Metcalf at Computer Video Games and his forward thinking on it. But we just believed in the coming together of aligned entertainment industries that were there to entertain, right? And the obstacles to it, I mean, that was a very early lesson for me in discovering that the obstacles to it wasn't generally the artist, but the record labels, and getting to the artists, if you could do that, and you could allow creative juices to run was for the most part. I mean, I know there's adverse stories about it, but for the most part, that was work. But the record labels, didn't rate games, saw it as a bit of a threat, and so forth. And of course, today, all they want to do is to break new acts through video games. We were thwarted by them all, so we all went off and built our own recording studios and did things like that. Created our own music, all of which came in-house, and they paid a price for that, and you look at where video games are today and where music is today.
Back then, they had like a lot of newspaper groups as well that were having their own video game divisions. So Mirrorsoft was one that we've talked about before, and Argus Press Software was another one from the Argus group, and they ended up taking over Quicksilver and kind of transitioning into Grand Slam. What was it like back then when that happened?
I remember talking to a famous guy in Formula One when his team got sold to an American conglomerate, one of the largest motor manufacturers in the world. And his description to me was it was a bad day at the office. And that would be my description of that arrangement. I mean, obviously they did have magazines in the gaming space. They were pretty ambitious. They had an alternative weekly magazine to Popcom Weekly, run by a guy called Paul Liptrot. And so we looked at it, and actually, you talk about at the introduction with a great friend of mine, Nick Alexander. The other interested party was Virgin, who'd entered the fray. Argus Press Software decided that they should be in games publishing, and they came after Quicksilver. Nick Lambert, one of the founders, had now decided that it was a business that he was uncomfortable with. He was traveling the world. His involvement on a day-to-day basis had diminished. And so I called him and told him about this. And I asked him what he wanted to do. And he said to me, how much will I make out of it? And I told him, and he said, well, can you give me that out of the company? And I said, no. And he said, well, I think we should sell it. And essentially, that's what happened. QS was based in Southampton with a group of free-spirited people that had developed a chemistry together that worked. And they wanted to, no sooner had they bought it, they wanted to take it up to London. I told him it wouldn't work that easily. And they said, well, now you're on the other side. It's your job to make that happen. But I'd also had inserted in my employment agreement with them that they couldn't move me within a 12-mile radius of Southampton. And so I went up to tell him I wasn't going to move. He said, go out and have lunch, think about it, don't be stupid, and come back. And I went out and had lunch. I called my lawyer and he said, tell him to get lost. I went back in and told him to get lost, and I left. So that was, they then didn't really do anything with the company because the heartbeat of the company, it wasn't just me, Mark Isles, Paul Cooper, guys like this had gone. And it came under the stewardship of a guy called Ron Harris. Nothing happened with it. And they basically got rid of it to Grand Slam Entertainment. And it was sad.
You hear that so often, we hear stories about larger companies acquiring small creative teams, when they take the people out of it, it's the heart and soul and all the creativity's gone, hasn't it? It's just a name then. And it's bizarre to me how many of these big companies didn't realize that at the time.
Yeah, they didn't back then. They were buying something that wasn't manageable in a corporate world and adopting their culture, their processes, their checks and balances. And you also have to understand that most of these companies of the day were early public companies. And for gaming companies that had come up by their bootstraps that hadn't had any experience of that, it was a mismatch. I would say it's a lot better today. It's not perfect. There are still notable instances of things that have gone wrong, but it is better. And I guess it could well have been better under the culture of Virgin, because, that's what Richard Branson epitomized. But, that's life. It didn't happen. And we go on from there.
Well, yourself and Paul Cooper, after Quicksilver, you went to establish Electric Dream Software in 1985. So what was kind of the story with that then and getting that started?
Well, partly Sandy White, because he was doing a follow-up game which was called Eye of the Mask. And he sent me this artwork, which was a triangular sort of depiction of my head in various colors. And he put at the top I, meaning me, and then of the mask, because the image was masked. And I thought, what the hell is this? And I called him and he said, it's our next game. And so around that, what I was actually looking to do was, by this time, Quicksilver had been distributed by CBS Records, now Sony Music. And that was one of the things that gave us global distribution. And you have to remember, this is at a time when nothing existed. And instead of building it in each territory, we used record labels, and it was CBS. And they distributed ColecoVision and a firm in the States called Epix, EPYX, who had Summer Games, Winter Games, Impossible Mission, other bits and pieces, all great software. And CBS told me they were pulling out of the marketplace, as were Epix. So I flew to San Francisco to get the rights to the products in Europe and on non-supported formats such as Sinclair and so forth. And when I arrived the day before I left, a headhunter called me about becoming head of Europe for a US software company. And I said to him, well, which company? And he said, oh, client confidentiality. We can't, disclose that. And I said, well, is it professional software, as it's called then, or is it games? And he said, no, it's games. I said, well, it's Activision, because Activision were the only ones. And he said, well, I couldn't possibly say. So anyhow, I flew out to San Francisco. I'm staying at the Fisherman's Wharf Marriott, and 8 o'clock in the morning, my phone rang, and it was Greg Fishback of Activision at the time. And he said, we're looking for someone to head up our European operation. And I said, oh, yeah. And he said, what are you doing in San Francisco? And I didn't want to tell him exactly what I was doing. So I said to him, I'm starting a new company. I'm out here sourcing software. He said, okay, great. Boom, 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 boom. Ended conversation. Later on that day, he called me and he said, I've been thinking about what you've been saying. And I said, yeah. He said, how would you like to be funded? And I said, yeah, that's pretty appealing. He said, well, if it is, you got to come down and see me. So I drove down to Mountain View, walked into the office. And bearing in mind, I hadn't got Epix and I didn't have a company. And I told him I was going to do all this stuff with software that's directed at Europe, whereas disk-based software was really limited. And that was the start of Electric Dreams. And I then went off and signed things like Eye of the Mask. I did various other products, and I used Activision's distribution. And I also picked up products out of Japan, such as Super Sprint and so forth. And as a consequence, at the time, Activision had some really pioneering product like Alter Ego, but it wasn't selling in Europe in any great volume. So the business that we had outperformed the parent. And so they then asked me to run the whole thing. So that's how that came about.
I was wondering, repackaging games and kind of making them appeal to the European market. What did you have to do differently?
Oh, a lot of it was a redesign of a game. As I said, it was linear versus random. And so you had to set out a pretty rigid story. You wouldn't do anything like that today. And to give an example of it, Activision had the rights to Lucasfilm, Rescue on Fractureless, and things like this. And they wanted them on the Spectrum. So between Activision, LucasArts, and ourselves, we had to rewrite it in a way that you could put it on tape and the game would evolve. In my view, it was never quite as good, but we did the best we could. And actually, the volume we got out of those, I think there was Eidolon, Rescue on Fractureless, couple of others, we did pretty well with it. So a lot of it involved, more than anything else, a redesign of the game mechanics so that they would run on a tape. And obviously, the other side is you had memory constraints.
Well, I know that R-Type, legendary, one of the most legendary shooters of the 80s, and that was a massive title. What was the story there? Because I heard it had a bit of a kind of troubled development cycle with the original version being shelved and then Manfred having to port it in 6 weeks or something. What was the real story there?
Yeah, that was through IRAM out of Japan, and they were not the easiest to... I had a great, and still have a great relationship with Japanese companies because you have to invest the time. When I was at Activision, I mean, I was grateful that they would fund me going out there, and I would come back and sit in quarterly reviews, and the CEO would look up and say, "Well, and what business have we got out of Japan this quarter?" And I would say none, and they would look heavenwards. But then once I'd gained their trust and broke through and started to work with Nintendo, Sega, Capcom, Konami, Namco as a standalone, and they didn't go anywhere else because I was always going out there. I didn't run away. I earned their trust, and so we became first port of call for many of the Japanese companies, and I met IREM and obviously R-Type, and we loved R-Type, and it was exactly, we in video games, we were the ill-disciplined rock and roll guys of the mix, and make no apologies for that, because if anyone was to say anything, I would say I did it with style and flair. And there was a lot about IREM that was troublesome behind the scenes in terms of their involvement in certain groups and so forth. And so I mean, that was there are many attempts. They'd failed. They hadn't come through. It wasn't always technical, although it was a technical challenge. It was often very much personality clash and not being able to work with them. But we could work with them. And then we had access to developers that could make it happen very quickly, and that's what we did.
Also, going for the kind of European market, especially with like the Amstrad and stuff, were there many language translations that you had to do, or like regional options to put into the titles?
Yeah, I mean, it was really, it's four, wasn't it? It's English, French, German, Spanish, that type of thing. And really, for the most part, it was, for us, which was Spectrum. Germany wasn't the biggest market. It was PC was more than 50% of the German market, and then Commodore. And so we really focused on France and Spain, which, apart from Sinclair, when Amstrad entered the market, those were some of their strongest sectors. And interestingly enough, in the very first international distribution deal I did was in Spain with a firm called Indiscomp, Jose Luis Dominguez. And I was looking for overseas distribution. I knew that Sinclair was out there, and so I flew out to Madrid, and I had no relationships. So I was walking around retail, finding computer stores, and I walked into this one, and I got chatting to the guy who could speak a bit of English, and I said, where'd you buy your product from? How'd you get it? Who's the wholesaler or distributor, and so forth? And he was telling me he just goes around fairs and picking it up. And I told him who we were and what I was looking to do, and I needed a distributor in Spain. And he said to me, "I'll be your distributor in Spain." And that is exactly what happened. We gave him the rights to our line at Quicksilver. And then one day he called me, and he said there were some Spanish developers that had written this game that he thought we may be interested in. So he came to London with it, and the game was called La Pulga, the Flea, and we loved it. Anyhow, so we signed a deal, and we got the rights to La Pulga, the Flea, which became Bugaboo. Right now, life goes on, and Amstrad enters Spain, and it wanted a distributor, so it bought Indiscomp, and Jose Luis Dominguez became the managing director of Amstrad España, and Amstrad published La Pulga, for which we had the rights. And so I sent in those days a telex to Alan Sugar and said these were ours, and he promptly told me in no uncertain terms to get lost. We didn't do anything more about it. But that was how we entered Spain. That was how we picked up Spanish product. And I read an interview recently with Jose Luis Dominguez, which was conducted down in Mallorca on his boat, and his boat is called Bugaboo. So, so there you go.
I was wondering, did other companies kind of see the American market or the Japanese one as a bit more sophisticated and superior than the European one, or look down on it at the time?
They definitely saw. Well, it was bigger. If you regionalize the thing, bearing in mind it was cut into three in those days. It was the United States and Canada, it was Europe, and it was Japan. And Europe was number three. And one and two was always a toss up, depending on the title, between Japan and the States, and that was really because of the large influence of coin-op, and then the consoles with Nintendo and Sega. They did look down on European software initially, but they then came to respect it. And I mean, a lot of the European software, as such, were conversions of games that were done in the States, or Japanese games, etc. I mean, I did quite a few of them at Activision, particularly with Sega titles like Afterburner and stuff like this. It was between us and US Gold. And US Gold, apart from having some Ocean as well, Ocean had strong relationships. They had Operation Wolf, and they had a strong relationship with Capcom. Jeff Brown at US Gold and Centresoft had strong relationships with Access and with Epix and some people in the States. And so we took stuff that was created and developed in the States and published it in Europe, and or converted it and published it in Europe. So that was why, I think.
I think, obviously one big difference about having, the home computer scene was much more successful in Europe than it was in like Japan, for example, where, it was a bit more console focused and America was like the NES. How much of a piracy problem did Activision have in Europe at that stage?
Yeah, I mean, piracy was a problem not confined to Europe. But, if I step back a little bit, the thing that was really obvious about the British scene was the development talent. The development talent and creativity in Europe was top draw, could compete against any of them. And I remember I was out in the States when I was at Activision, and I was walking into places and I was seeing all these incredible setups with workstations and great, hosting computers and so forth. And they weren't necessarily any better or as good as what was done in the UK. And I asked an American, pretty good guy from a technical point of view, why he thought that was. And he said, because you guys, your source was normally something like a BBC microcomputer or a Sinclair Spectrum, which against what was available to developers over theirs, meant we had to work harder and get more out of the processors than the counterparts over there who were lazier and not as creative. And I actually think that was probably true at the time. And so when you start to think of what went on through the BBC, which was the adopted thing in our schools and so forth, we got huge amounts out of it, and I think that stood the test of time. Plus, there was a cultural thing. I mean, if you looked at movies, we always followed, but we were always like number 2 or 3 ahead of anyone else, and I think it created this hotbed of talent, and some of which migrated to the States and so forth. What was the second part of the question?
It was more about whether piracy was a big issue for on the computers.
Well, because it was, and it was mainly because of tape, right? And which was very easy to pirate. And I remember I did a Newsnight program where we tracked and followed them around in the UK. I also remember I went out to Singapore when we were under the ownership of Argus Press Software, and a member of the board was a guy called Tim Gold-Blythe, who was also, and Michael Spicer, who's in the government. And we went out to Singapore as part of a British trade delegation, and I was out there, and we were all being politically correct and saying all the right things. And this Chinese guy came up to me and said, "Do you realize your software is being pirated in Singapore?" And I said, "No, why?" He said, "Come with me." Now, why I did this, I don't know. I just jumped in his car and went off with him, and he took me around the back streets, took me into this place, and there were all our games. And actually, they were pretty pretty good. And so I said to the guy, the owner of the shop, I said, these are my games. He said, no, they're mine. I said, no, they're mine. That's my copyright. And he said, no, I made them here in this shop. They're mine. And that was their logic. And so I started to do something about it. And I had an interview with a newspaper out there called the Straits Times, and which was everywhere because this guy was the official distributor of Sinclair. And so I called Sinclair about it. And anyhow, the next thing I got a call from British Electric Traction, who's the ultimate holding company, and telling me to back off and not do this because it wasn't good for relationships. And so I had to drop it. But piracy was a big problem everywhere. And I mean, there were some of us reckoned, depending on the game, anywhere 3 to 10 times copies were out in the open market. And that started to have an impact on the industry overall. So it was a big problem. And I mean, if you bring it fast forward to today, I remember going out to China in the very early days and talking to companies like Shanda who were struggling with this. And they said, well, you may as well give the game away free. And really, that was the prelude to free to play because they couldn't beat the pirates, no matter how sophisticated encryption they had and so forth. So they, again, changed the game design, gave it away, and then went back to a coin-op model where you design it for people to keep, paying microtransactions to get through the game.
Well, in 1991, you joined Acclaim Entertainment, and The Simpsons at the time was like worldwide huge hit, and they were releasing kind of Simpsons games. Did you guys work closely with the Simpsons people at all?
Yeah. I mean, it was fantastic. I mean, we did all the Simpsons games, Krusty's Funhouse, the whole lot. We had, you have to work closely initially with Fox, but also Matt Groening on the game design. Some of the development was done in the UK as well. And so we did work closely with them. And I'll never forget, because in those days in video games, you had 5 licenses, a license for 5 games granted by Nintendo and the same by Sega. And, Acclaim bought a company called LJN. So in that way, we could have 10 games a year to get out there. And Nintendo was distributed by a company down in Portsmouth where Mike Hayes was the head of marketing. And we spoke, and he agreed to promote The Simpsons. And when I went down there to do it all, it was using Bart to promote Mario and the SNES system. And I told him I was irritated by that. But it also led ultimately to us breaking open distribution. We were the first people to do that. We broke, and it was pretty brave at the time because we escaped the clutches of the hardware, the platform holders, and did our own distribution using Polygram for the physical stuff, and then all the video stores, because they were open from 8 in the morning to 10 at night. And that was the way we could break it open and open up the whole market, which is what the market benefits from today.
Yeah, and I mean, I remember, as a 10-year-old kid getting Bart versus the Space Mutants packed in with my Amiga 500, it came with it, and seeing that introduction animation, it was cartoon perfect, and obviously Bart Simpson was the coolest character in the world for 10-year-old boys at that time, so you hit the market perfectly.
Yeah, I mean, it was... but the language, right, and the whole terminology and the style, I mean, it became a whole thing right the way, across the... it was great. And of course, it was truly global. And they were good to work with. And they're just, I've had the privilege of working with those guys, and in later life, the South Park guys. And, it's grown through a generation where they've embraced video games, so they get it and they're good to work with, and they have their own views, and you have a pooling of creators' resources, which becomes very fertile.
Well, if we're talking about massive hits in the early 90s, I remember that Acclaim handled the home ports of Mortal Kombat, which was a legendary... I mean, my jaw dropped when I first played that in the arcades. And the hype around that game as well. I mean, what do you remember about that game and kind of building up that media hype? And did you get any backlash from, I remember there's a lot of outrage about the blood in the game, which looks very tame today, those original games, but at the time was quite shocking.
Yeah, no, I got hauled up in all sorts of areas to answer for it, and lots of aggressive letters from people and so forth. But we knew, it's the same thing. It came out of Midway, coin op, and, we saw it. We wanted to do it. They agreed to license it. And for the most part, the relationship was pretty harmonious. And then to take it over here. But if there was one thing Acclaim was literally brilliant at, it was marketing, which was led by a guy called Rob Holmes, who was a pure genius at it, and a guy called Sam Goldberg. And they came up with a campaign which was filmed down in Wall Street with a load of kids showing aggression with their hands up in the air going, Mortal Kombat. And so I did things like that. And then I sponsored there was big boxing matches between Chris Eubank and Nigel Benn, which they were hyping up as war. So I sponsored those matches. So on the ring floor, it had Mortal Kombat and such like. Anyhow, by this time, Acclaim was pretty well established in Europe. We had all our offices, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, etc. And I came back with this outtake of the marketing of the TV commercial that we were going to use. And, the French looked at it and said, this will never work in France. The Germans put their head between hands and said, you cannot do this in Germany, and so forth. Now, our budgets were such, they were pretty big budgets. So I allowed them to go out and get their creatives on making their own TV commercials for each territory. And they went off and did it, and they came back, and I didn't like any of it. And so I then exercised CEO control, if you like, and said, you're going to use it. Anyhow, the next thing was it got an award in Germany. It, got them all carried away in France, and it became the campaign that ran everywhere, that embraced everything. And we put it out there. We put it, in movie theaters. We put it on billboards. We put it on TV, and we did the whole thing. And of course, as you say, it attracted. I think it was Ann Widdecombe at the time calling me about it. I had to appear before the Senate, who read out this text, and they said, do I recognize it? And I said, yes. And they said, why? I said, because it's the instructions for Mortal Kombat. And I think it was Joe Lieberman looked up and he said, you think that's right? I said, I think gamers can distinguish between fantasy and reality, and politicians can't. So I've never thought we were out there being irresponsible, killing people, or, video games. It didn't create Mosside in Manchester or the Gorbals in Glasgow. Kids from an early age would be in forests breaking twigs and pointing them at each other as though it was games. So I didn't mind the debate, and my conscience was clear. And we were breaking through to a mass market, and as you say, by today's comparisons, it's tame.
Must admit, though, it did make us want to play the game even more.
Of
when
course,
we read all that stuff.
It always does, right? It's a Sex Pistols moment,
Yeah. Well, let's talk about another game that had, I remember, had massive hype, probably the biggest hype of any game in the 90s. And Acclaim published this, Rise of the Robots. And I remember, there was a lot around that game that it's going to have, the music from Brian May, and it's going to have this incredible artificial intelligence that we'd never seen in a fighting game before. And then when the reviews came out, it all kind of fell a bit flat. I mean, what do you kind of remember about that then? And was that kind of a game that failed to deliver?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're being polite to me. In terms of the reviews, it was probably, it's up there for about the worst game published. The concept we had a guy working for us called Andy Wood, who I think a lot of, and he worked with the development group up in Manchester, and they came up with this concept that we liked. Plus, he knew Brian May, and he could access Brian May. So, I've seen loads of game treatments over the years that when you start off, they look great. And a lot of people don't realize this, but when it comes together at the end, it's not so great. But that one was actually poor, and so the reviews and the backlash that we got were fully justified. And with the benefit of hindsight, probably shouldn't have published it, but we did.
Yeah, I guess after all that hype, you couldn't have not put it out.
Yeah, you don't, when people talk to me about things, I mean, you don't have 100% track record. And when people talk to me about so who's got 100%, they've either done one thing or they're probably a liar.
Yeah. And that's the thing with that game. I mean, I remember I got it for Christmas, 1995, and I remember booting it up on like 13 floppy disks. And graphically, it was groundbreaking graphically. I'd never seen that kind of smooth animation, but the gameplay areas where it kind of fell down.
Again, hindsight's a wonderful thing. We should have probably given it more time, but we also had memory constraints because of the graphics. Anyhow, it wasn't our finest hour.
I was quite surprised to see that it got a sequel, though, Rise to Resurrection. I mean, how did they kind of sell that to get a sequel?
I think that was Andy Wood pushing it like mad and having his own ambitions in the space. But I don't think it fared a lot better.
Well, it's nice to hear someone finally talk about Rise of the Robots, because most people kind of swerve it, so we appreciate that.
It's a big black spot. No one knows about what happened.
Yeah, you have to take them on the chin when it goes against you. Everyone's got them.
Yeah,
I was wondering, during the kind of console wars, it was massively heated with, Sega and Nintendo. Were you guys getting pressure from the different companies or like incentives and stuff like that to kind of port and have the better port for their system?
Yeah. I mean, and I don't blame them for that. I mean, we had relationships with both because, back in the early days, I licensed so much product from Sega, where Nick was also at Sega. But I mean, I had a good relationship with the head of Sega, Nakayama, and so forth. And he was a pretty decent supporter of Acclaim. But the closest relationship of all was the relationship between Nintendo and Acclaim, which no one else had. I mean, it was a closer relationship than that enjoyed by, our competitors like EA, because they wouldn't support everything. And Acclaim was a big supporter of Nintendo and came into existence because of Nintendo, because Greg Fishback had flown after he left RCA Records. He flew out to Kyoto and he got a license to publish on the Nintendo platform, but he didn't have a company. The license was granted in the name of Greg Fishback originally, and then when the company happened, everything was changed over. But Nintendo were great supporters, and the original starting points of Acclaim was to take games from Japan and badge them with American licenses like Knight Rider and so forth, and that started to put Acclaim on the map. So the relationship was always closer with Nintendo, and when Acclaim bought a comic book company, Valiant, within there was Turok, and Nintendo wanted an exclusive product from Acclaim that would not be on any other platform. We gave them Turok, and that became a big hit too. And obviously, as you've already alluded to, Nintendo offered great incentives by way of marketing initiatives, and it worked for both companies.
Well, that transition from 16 to 32-bit consoles was, a bit of a tricky time, because I remember you had so many consoles that came onto the market that were a bit flash in the pan, like, the Amiga CD32 and the Atari Jaguar, and, systems that weren't around for very long. And then we had the Sega Saturn coming along and the PlayStation, the N64. I mean, was it kind of hard for Acclaim to pick the right systems to back? Stuff like the Mega CD coming along as well that kind of muddied the water.
Yeah, there was a certain level of compromise because, supporting those platforms or risk losing support in the future. But the real issue was the inventory risk because, until the PlayStation came along, we were really on cartridge. And if you got it wrong, and you have to pay up front. So in terms of a cash model, it was all cash outflow. I mean, you funded the development, which, 12 to 18 months in those days. You had to fund the manufacturing to fairly long lead times. you would push it out at retail, who would take 90 days to pay you. So the risk was in that inventory, and it was a destructive force to a lot of companies, Acclaim included, but not just Acclaim. And then you did have the thing that sits on the top of it is the relationship between the hardware vendors, and to navigate that was not necessarily an easy task in keeping them all happy. And then, of course, as you rightly pointed out, PlayStation came into the market, Microsoft with Xbox came into the market, and the landscape started to change. And, clearly at the end, Acclaim didn't do a very good job of that. I think its product quality was not where it needed to be, even though it owned a significant development resource, because we bought Probe, we bought Iguana, we bought Sculptured Software. So we had this development resource, but I think it was a weakness. If you asked me to point to any one area, I would say it was the weakness of the product development versus some of our competitors like EA, who I've got nothing but admiration and respect for, and the people there.
Were they kind of trying to hit that more like risky adult gamer market as the PlayStation came out? Gamers kind of evolved into that market, because I heard there was a few like gimmicks that kind of backfired. One was famously the
BMX Triple X.
Yeah, and also name your child a Turok as well.
Yeah, that was different. I mean, the games, we were trying to appeal to a broader audience, and we were being encouraged by the hardware platform, particularly Sony. I mean, we started off in a business which was pretty young, particularly on Nintendo, right? And, you might talk about 12 to 16-year-old males at one point in time. And now we were going into a market which was 4 to 40-year-olds, and you had to appeal. Plus, you had regional differences as well. That you had to do. So the marketing side of those initiatives was really a European thing, paying speeding fines in France, headstones in cemeteries in the UK. And that was Phil Lay, who was formerly at Sega and then went to Sky, and a guy called Simon Smith Wright, who, funnily enough, went to EA. And for the most part, they worked. But in terms of some of the development, particularly, desperate sensationalism for things like BMX Triple X, that clearly was a monumental failure and shouldn't have happened.
What was the story with that then? Because I know that got quite a backlash. What was the whole scenario around that BMX Triple X game?
Well, we'd had code because we were doing things like ATV and other BMX games that we could use. Public company, we needed to get product out to meet quarterly objectives and cash flows and things like that. And there were people in the States that thought that the market was now opening up in the way that movies had done. So you could have a segment in there which appealed to a more adult audience. And some of the stats that came back was suggesting just that. Plus, when it was announced, the feedback we were getting was phenomenal. The difference was because it was an environment controlled by retail, the retailers did not share that view, objected to it, basically didn't stock it. Some of the other sponsors or licensor didn't objected to it. And so forth, and it shouldn't. You can't hide behind the fact they shouldn't have done it. They did do it. It was never going to work in Europe, but it didn't work in the US either.
And there was a lot of that kind of sexuality in games, with like Lara Croft being sexualized and Dead or Alive and stuff like that around that time, as that market kind of increased. Yeah.
I mean, one of the big things about Tomb Raider and Lara Croft were the cheats and the codes, right, which were readily available out there because everyone wanted to get in and undress Lara Croft, So there was a big element in gaming, almost this underground culture where that appealed. And it is. You look at TV today and look at films and things like that, and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and what appeals to what audience, and at what point do you impose censorship? I mean, look at Grand Theft Auto. and so forth. So, you have to look beyond a certain segment. And is it our job to sit and tell everyone what they can and can't have?
Well, Acclaim, I mean, had a great legacy of some incredible titles. And then, in 2004, I know they fell for bankruptcy. And it looked, from what I've seen, it looked quite a messy end to the company. Yeah. I mean, obviously, what was what happened from your perspective, and how did you end up moving on to Codemasters then?
Yeah, that was a horrible time. I mean, I've been with Acclaim for 13 years. I built the operations outside the United States. I brought people in. Either, if I had to point to one thing I'm pretty proud of in my career in the industry, it's bringing people in and giving them a career. And so a lot of those people had joined the company because of me and followed me and stayed loyal to me. And Europe was always very successful, always profitable, and so forth. And when it got into trouble in the US, the Americans asked me if I'd go there and run it. Now, the easy thing to do would have been to walk away from it and being the fat cat walking up the road to a competitor. And I couldn't do that. I just could not do that. So I rolled up my sleeves and said, we'll go over there for 6 months. I didn't take my family because, it was risky, and we'll fight the battle. And we were on the verge of turning it around, and we didn't. We lost the battle. I still would contend that it could have been saved and should have been saved. When I look at the catalogue and you think of what that would be in today's market. So it was messy, and then you get caught up in all the aspects, all the wonderful aspects of American corporate law, and which is not to be recommended. But what I had done, to answer your question, is worked with investment bankers throughout my time at Acclaim, because it was a public company and it took me into areas that I wasn't familiar with, because we were either making acquisitions, raising money, or selling things. And it gave me pretty close contact with the investment banking community. And then coupled with that, obviously, being around in Britain for as long as I have, you're into the folklore of Britain. And within the folklore of Britain is the Darling family, and obviously Codemasters. So I knew the Darlings, and at the time I was actually, after Acclaim, I was trying to buy IDOS, backed by Francisco Partners, a US-based private equity company. And while I was doing that, camped in rooms in Wimbledon, I got a call from someone who I hadn't seen for a number of years, but had dealt with at Acclaim, which was a guy called Enon Kreitz, who ran Fox Kids, left Fox Kids. I asked him where he was going, and he said to me, who knows, maybe video games. And he called me about 4 years later, and completely out of the blue, and said he was in investment banking, he was with Benchmark Capital, and he'd invested in Codemasters, and could I tell him anything about it? So I kept telling him things and what I thought, etc. And one day he invited me up to London to have breakfast with him in their office, which was in Balderton Street, hence they're now called Balderton. And I walked in, he wasn't there. I went into a conference room. There was coffee and croissants at one end. I picked up the coffee jug. I picked up a cup, and I never quite got the coffee in the jug before the door burst open, and Enon stood there saying, Rod, I want you to be the new CEO of Codemasters. And I put the thing down, and I said, Enon, nice to see you after all this time. And I told him I wouldn't do it because I lived in southern England and they were in the Midlands. But I said I'd help him if there were any issues. Anyhow, it was a May bank holiday weekend. I was at home. There were some friends of mine with me, and someone knocked at the door, outside the door, and Enon was stood there, and he said, Rod, I'm going to make you see sense. And on the Tuesday, I started at Codemasters.
Very persuasive.
That was how it happened.
Well, Rod, we could talk to you all night about, your incredible memories from just covering that, 40 odd years then. I mean, obviously, we all heard the news last week that Microsoft bought Activision for $68 billion. So that kind of proves what an industry you and your contemporaries created, that, it's worth that much today.
I know, it's what Mel Croucher writes about. He's, and another guy sent me a text just the other day, and he said, "Have you still got your shares?" And, I wish. He said, but Mel Croucher's final thing was, where did we go wrong? And I always believed in the industry. I mean, don't get me wrong, I didn't think anyone could predict at that time that a company that had also gone through its troubled times. Don't forget Activision, when Bobby Kotick got it, had been in Chapter 11 in the US. So it was video games were volatile. I mean, I asked Polygram if they would ever buy a video game company, and Alan Levy, who was the head of it, said no, because there's no catalog. Well, today, if you look at the IP that crosses over formats, crosses over generations of hardware, there's more catalog than what there is in the music industry. But the volatility back in those days made it, the British financial community, who can't wait to get into it at every opportunity today, steered well clear of it. You look at what happened to IDOS and things like this. So we were in the Wild West. But I always believed that video games would become the entertainment medium of choice for people, and not just for the young. And I did an academy in Maida Vale in London, and we were at a prize giving day, and the academies are all very political, with all the political parties claiming credit. And so the kids had all these speeches from the headmasters and various dignitaries representing political parties, and I was getting bored. And then the headmaster asked me if I'd say a few words, and I had nothing prepared. But I was minded of Larry, the Oracle guy, Larry Ellison, thing to the Senate when he said, "Is Microsoft a monopoly?" And he asked how many of them used Office, and of course they all did. And so I stood before these kids, and I said, "How many of you play video games?" And lots of the hands went up, most of the hands went up. And I said, "Well, look, let me tell you something. You can be a musician, you can be an artist, you can be a programmer, you can be a data scientist, you can be a marketeer, you can be a sales guy. That's what video games offer you as a career today. And your job is to do well at school and come and knock on my door and make me employ you." Because that's what video games have done. I mean, it's given people careers in ways that if you went to a career officer in a school years ago, wouldn't even come up. I talk at schools about it today. I did one in London a couple of months ago, and I asked, I was talking to the kids. The staff had brought me in, and I'd stopped everything and turned to the staff and said, "Do you give these kids advice on being influencers?" Because it's a different world, and you have to look at it. And I've always believed video games would offer choice in terms of careers to the next generation, whatever that next generation is, and wherever that next generation takes the industry. And that's what makes it so exciting. And that's why I've always been a student of the world market.
Well, Rod, I think that's a perfect point to end on there. It has been incredible hearing your stories, and thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share them with us. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, it's a pleasure talking to you, and I'm grateful to you for allowing me to relive these events. And it is 40 years, and you make an old man very happy. So thank you very much.